Picture this. A young man, strikingly handsome, confident, and articulate. Someone you would call charismatic, even charming. He walks into a room, and everyone notices him. He's the kind of person who exudes an effortless likability, who can make anyone feel at ease with just a smile. For those who knew him, Ted Bundy seemed to have it all: intelligence, ambition, and the promise of a successful future. He was a student at the University of Washington, a law school hopeful, well-liked by his peers, and seemingly destined for greatness. He was the kind of man you would introduce to your family, confident he would fit right in. But behind the eyes of this seemingly perfect man, there was something darker, something more sinister lurking, and nobody knew it. Not his friends, not his family, not even the women who found themselves drawn to him. For years, Bundy was able to hide his true nature, playing the role of the ideal student, the perfect gentleman. But all the while, he was concealing a horrific secret, a pattern of unspeakable violence that would send shockwaves across the nation. How did Ted Bundy, a man with such charm, such promise, turn into one of the most notorious serial killers in American history? How did he manage to elude authorities, manipulate his way into people's lives, and leave behind a trail of horror and tragedy? The truth is far more chilling than anyone could have imagined. Bundy's path to darkness didn't happen overnight. It was a carefully crafted transformation, one that would make him not only a killer, but a master of deception. He had learned to manipulate everyone around him, using his charm as a weapon, lulling his victims into a false sense of security before he struck. And as the bodies of young women began to pile up across several states, no one could have imagined that the man behind these brutal murders was the very same man who had once smiled at them in passing. No one could fathom that the person they had trusted was living a double life, hiding in plain sight. What started as a promising future would soon descend into a nightmare that would forever alter the lives of countless women, their families, and an entire nation. Ted Bundy's true identity was about to be revealed, but not before he left a legacy of terror that would haunt America for years to come. Ted Bundy had all the makings of a success story: a charming, good-looking young man with a sharp intellect and an undeniable presence. He quickly captured the attention of those around him. It was the early 1970s, and Bundy was a student at the University of Washington. He was polite, well-spoken, and seemingly eager to make the most of his academic opportunities. To those who met him, he was the epitome of the kind of young man any parent would hope their child would bring home. He was bright, driven, and ambitious, someone who appeared to be on the path to greatness. He was a man who appeared to have it all. His future stretched out before him, filled with promise and endless possibilities. People saw him as someone they could rely on, someone who blended seamlessly into their lives. No one suspected the darker side of him, the side that would go on to destroy the lives of so many innocent people. At the University of Washington, Bundy excelled in his studies, making strides toward his dream of becoming a lawyer. His professors noticed his determination and his ability to grasp complex subjects. But it wasn't just his academic success that made him stand out. It was the way he interacted with others. Bundy knew how to win people over. Whether it was his disarming smile or his easy conversation, he seemed like the type of person everyone would want to befriend. One of his close friends from his time at the university later recalled Bundy as someone who could talk his way out of almost anything. He had this magnetic quality, she said. He could make anyone believe anything. He was so convincing, and he made people feel like they were the most important person in the room. And it wasn't just the women he was surrounded by that were drawn to him. Ted Bundy was the kind of guy who had a way of making everyone feel comfortable. Men admired him for his confidence, while women were charmed by his manner and sophistication. He wasn't overly flashy. Instead, he had an understated charisma that put people at ease. At parties and social gatherings, he moved through the crowd with ease, blending in but standing out in subtle ways. People gravitated toward him, often without even realizing it. He could talk to anyone, rich or poor, young or old, and make them feel important. Despite his popularity, Ted Bundy didn't seem to be the kind of guy who would ever draw attention to himself in a negative way. He was often described as modest, humble, and respectful. He would go out of his way to help people, offering rides when they needed one or helping classmates with their studies. He always appeared genuine in his actions. It was the kind of image that made him appear utterly trustworthy. Yet, as much as he seemed to be an open book, Ted Bundy remained an enigma to many of those around him. He was a master of keeping his true thoughts, his real self, hidden behind that polished exterior. To his friends, he was an ideal student, someone who carried himself with poise and sophistication. But there was a layer to him, one that no one could see, that was colder, darker, and more dangerous than anyone could imagine. His relationships with women were particularly noteworthy. Bundy had a long history of romantic entanglements, some brief and others more serious. In one instance, he entered a relationship with a woman named Elizabeth Klopfer, a single mother who worked as a secretary. By all outward appearances, their relationship seemed to be one of mutual respect and affection. She saw him as a man who could do no wrong. He would visit her and her daughter regularly, always playing the role of the caring, doting boyfriend. They spent time together like any other couple, enjoying outings, taking trips, and sharing private moments. Elizabeth was convinced that Ted was the man she would marry, the man who would change her life forever. But even in their relationship, there were signs that something wasn't right. Though Elizabeth couldn't see it at the time, Ted had a way of drawing her in, making her feel safe and loved. Yet, there were moments of coldness, flashes of temper, and instances where his charming persona cracked, revealing a less composed side to him. She just didn't know what to make of it. And so, like many others, she dismissed the strange feelings as nothing more than minor imperfections. His friends would later describe him as someone who could be charming one moment, and then distant or indifferent the next. Bundy didn't show many emotions outwardly, and when he did, they were often measured, calculated. He knew how to play people like a finely tuned instrument, and he did it expertly. But while Bundy worked hard to project an image of normalcy, there were whispers of a deeper issue, a pattern of strange behavior, which many of those around him couldn't quite place. Ted was often seen walking alone, or staring off into the distance with a look of deep contemplation. Friends noticed his tendency to disappear for days at a time. When questioned about his whereabouts, Bundy would offer up a quick and convincing excuse. Sometimes it was just schoolwork or he was visiting his family. But there were gaps in his story, inconsistencies that no one really paid attention to at the time. One of the most unsettling traits about Bundy was his ability to compartmentalize his life. He could seamlessly switch between being a kind, attentive boyfriend and then later a cold, calculating predator. He could be talking to a professor one moment, discussing legal theory, and then the next he'd be slipping into the shadows, targeting his next victim. Bundy had developed the perfect persona. The ambitious student, the devoted boyfriend, the friendly, trustworthy neighbor. And no one, absolutely no one, suspected the truth. To them, he was just another face in the crowd. For all his charm, for all his carefully crafted personas, there was something about Ted Bundy that even he could not escape. Beneath the smooth talk, the winning smile, and the seemingly genuine affection he showed toward others, something darker and dangerous was beginning to take shape. And in 1974, that darkness would break free, revealing itself in the most chilling way. It was a foggy evening in January, a typical winter night on the University of Washington campus. The streets were empty, the campus quiet, the kind of night when the world seems still, unaware of the chaos that's about to unfold. A young woman, just 21 years old, was walking home alone after a long day. Her name was Linda Ann Healy. She had a bright future ahead of her. Smart, ambitious, and loved by everyone who knew her. But she didn't know that on this night, her path would intersect with that of a predator. Bundy had been watching her for days, learning her routine, studying her every move. He knew that she would be walking alone, and he knew just how to approach her. It wasn't difficult. After all, he was the master of deception. His face, his voice, his charm, they were all part of the trap. As Linda made her way down the quiet street, she had no reason to be suspicious of the man who suddenly appeared before her. He asked for help, offering a simple question, an innocent request for assistance, something she would have seen as harmless. But what Linda didn't know was that Bundy had planned every detail of this moment. He had carefully chosen her as his first victim. He wasn't just looking for help. He was looking for an opportunity to strike. His words were carefully calculated, designed to put her at ease and make her trust him. He was good at that, too good. And just like that, she was in his grip. He lured her to his car with a story of needing help. His arm in a sling, a fake injury. She took the bait. Once she was inside, Bundy wasted no time. The door slammed shut behind her, and in the blink of an eye, everything changed. The car sped off, and the world outside faded into the distance, replaced by a suffocating silence. The calm facade of the evening shattered. In the confines of his car, Bundy attacked. What happened in those moments remains a mystery, but the outcome was clear. Linda and Healy, once full of promise, was never seen alive again. Her body was discovered months later, but the brutality of her murder, its methodical, calculated execution, would serve as the first horrifying clue of the darkness that lurked beneath Ted Bundy's charming exterior. This murder was no spur-of-the-moment act of rage. It was a premeditated crime, planned with precision. Bundy knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew it would lead to more. Linda Healy's death wasn't an isolated incident. It was the beginning of a long, terrifying spree, one that would shake the nation and haunt countless families. And it all started with a smile, a few polite words, and a simple request for help. The murders began to flood in, each more brutal than the last. Ted Bundy, a man who had lived his life under the guise of charm and normalcy, was now a predator. His face was everywhere, on the news, on the lips of terrified citizens. But no one had any idea who he really was. And with every passing day, his killing spree stretched further and further across the United States, spreading fear like wildfire. In 1974, Bundy's first victims were young women, bright and full of promise, who simply happened to cross his path. Women like Linda and Healy, who disappeared without a trace. Her body never to be found until months later. And then there was the steady parade of others, women whose names would be forever linked to the terror he wrought across Washington, Utah, and Colorado. Each of them was someone's daughter, a sister, a friend, a student, a colleague, a mother, perhaps waiting for a phone call. Their hopes and dreams cruelly ripped from them. The pain of their families stretched far beyond the individual tragedies. These were not just victims. These were lives lost too soon, to a man who had no regard for human life. Bundy knew exactly what he was doing. The more he killed, the more he felt the rush of power, the more he relished the control he had over his victims. The violence escalated in ways no one could have predicted. He was no longer just abducting women. Now, he was subjecting them to unfathomable cruelty, inflicting pain and suffering in a way that made even the most hardened investigators recoil in horror. And still, he seemed to slip through the cracks of the law, leaving no trace behind but the broken lives of those who had loved and cherished his victims. Bundy would approach them in broad daylight, in parking lots, at bus stops, or on university campuses, always in plain sight, always pretending to be something he wasn't. The mask was always the same: polite, disarming, kind. A broken arm here, a friendly question there. A small act of sympathy that was the very thing that led these women to trust him. But with every death, his method grew more calculated. The details of each murder were chilling in their precision. Bundy began to escalate, not content with the simple act of killing. No, he wanted to break something in his victims before the final blow. The brutality of his actions left a deep scar on the community. A community that now had to face the haunting realization that their worst fears were real, that the killer was still out there, watching them, planning his next strike. But even more devastating was the toll on the families of those he killed. The endless nights of uncertainty, of hoping against hope that their daughter would come home. The agonizing months when they held on to the hope that maybe their loved one had simply run away, not knowing they had been taken by someone they could never have imagined. The heartbreak of seeing their child's name in the headlines, knowing that they would never get to see them again, never get to hug them, never get to hear their laugh or see their smile. The police were overwhelmed. Each new report, each new clue seemed to pull them further away from the truth. And with every false lead, every dead end, Bundy's confidence grew. He wasn't just killing anymore, he was toying with them. The letters he sent to the press were cruel mockeries, taunts at the investigators who were no closer to solving the case than they were when it all began. But even as Bundy eluded capture, he couldn't escape the weight of his actions. With every victim, the emotional toll on the families grew more unbearable. The quiet grief of parents who couldn't sleep, who couldn't eat, because their children had vanished. The endless questions, the agonizing uncertainty, the memories of lives lost. What had their daughters, sisters, and friends done to deserve this? In Utah, the body of another young woman was discovered, brutally beaten and left in the woods. Then, in Colorado, a similar scene unfolded. And with every victim, Bundy became more brazen. No longer content with hiding in the shadows, he was now moving across states, leaving a wake of broken families, destroyed communities, and unanswered questions. The women were gone, and their families were left behind in a world that could never be the same. The pain of these senseless murders hung over every family like a cloud, the wound never closing. The fathers who would never walk their daughters down the aisle. The mothers who would never hear their daughters' laughter again. The brothers who would never protect their sisters. And the world would never know these women for what they could have been, the artists, the students, the dreamers they once were. Now, all that remained was the hollow emptiness of loss. Each victim added another layer of sorrow to the community, another deep wound that would never heal. And though the police were working tirelessly, they were no closer to catching the man responsible for these horrific acts. Ted Bundy, the charming student, the perfect young man, was slowly revealing himself as the monster he truly was. And he was not done yet. The spree was far from over, and the worst was yet to come. As the bodies piled up, something else began to emerge. A chilling aspect of Bundy's personality that made his crimes even more terrifying. It wasn't just the violence that consumed him, but the game. The sick, twisted game of cat and mouse that he played with the police, the press, and the terrified public. Ted Bundy didn't just kill, he wanted to be caught, but only on his terms. Bundy's intellect was one of his most dangerous weapons. He wasn't content with simply evading capture. He took pleasure in mocking the very authorities that were desperately trying to stop him. And so, as the investigation dragged on, Bundy began sending letters to newspapers and law enforcement. These were not just letters. They were riddles, puzzles, and cryptic messages that turned the investigation into a nightmarish game of deduction. He took pleasure in the power he held, knowing the authorities were scrambling to decipher his words, trying to unlock the twisted code he left behind. The letters themselves were unsettling in their simplicity, but they were filled with ominous threats, strange symbols, and references to his own deeds, often written in a cold, detached manner that revealed Bundy's utter lack of remorse. As he typed, it was as though he were speaking directly to the public, daring anyone to figure him out, to understand his mind, to catch him. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a master manipulator, a criminal mastermind who loved the spotlight, who reveled in the chaos his words created. Some of the letters were straightforward, but others were filled with strange symbols, ciphers that seemed to mock the intelligence of the police. Bundy left behind an eerie trail of clues, each one more frustrating than the last, as if daring law enforcement to crack the code. Some thought that Bundy was trying to prove his superiority. Others believed he was doing it to confuse the investigators, to make them second-guess themselves. In his mind, it was all a game, and he was always a step ahead. In one of his letters, Bundy made veiled threats, warning the public of the next woman he would target, while offering no real clues as to who she might be or when the killing would happen. This was no ordinary criminal. He was playing with fire, pushing the boundaries of what anyone could tolerate. Bundy wasn't just hiding in the shadows anymore. He was actively participating in the fear that consumed the nation, stirring the pot with each letter, each line of text. For Bundy, it was no longer just about taking lives. It was about instilling fear. He wanted the police to know that they were powerless. He wanted the public to be terrified, constantly looking over their shoulders, never knowing if they were safe or if they would be his next victim. His letters weren't just taunts. They were declarations of control. With each cryptic message, Bundy was reaffirming that he was not just a killer but a puppet master. And everyone, police, victims, and the public alike, were his unwilling participants. As the letters piled up, so did the anxiety. Each message left behind seemed to taunt investigators, offering no clear answers, only more questions. It became a vicious cycle of frustration, as police worked tirelessly to decode the messages. But Bundy remained elusive. He was playing a game, and the world was forced to watch as he stayed one step ahead. It was clear now, Ted Bundy was no ordinary killer. He was intelligent, methodical, and cruel, and his need to control the narrative was just as sickening as the murders he committed. Each cipher, each letter, added another layer of terror to the already devastating situation. The authorities had no way of knowing if the letters were just random ramblings or if Bundy was, in fact, leaving behind vital clues. All they could do was scramble to keep up with the madman who was always one move ahead. Meanwhile, families and loved ones waited, helplessly, hopelessly, for an end to the nightmare. In 1977, just when the authorities thought they had him cornered, Ted Bundy did the unimaginable. He escaped. After years of eluding capture, he managed to slip through their fingers yet again. A simple mistake, a single opportunity, and Bundy was free once more. But this time, he wasn't just running from the law. He was about to enter the final, most terrifying chapter of his reign of terror. Bundy's escape was not the result of some elaborate plot, but rather the result of his cunning and his complete understanding of the system that imprisoned him. Using his intelligence and charm to his advantage, Bundy managed to evade his captors for weeks, hiding in plain sight. As he crawled through a small opening in the ceiling of his cell, slipping into the night like a shadow, the escape set the stage for the next horrific act in his grisly career. For a brief moment, it seemed like the nightmare was over. But it wasn't. The nightmare was only beginning. After his escape, Bundy traveled across the country, slipping in and out of states with ease. His next destination was Florida, a place that would become forever linked to his name and to the most brutal, horrifying crimes of his entire spree. It was in Florida that Bundy would commit some of his most infamous murders, crimes that would become etched into the history of true crime. On January 15, 1978, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. Under the cover of darkness, Bundy quietly entered the house and moved through the hallways, targeting the young women who lived there. His violence was unrestrained, leaving a trail of horror in his wake. The brutality of what happened inside those walls would shock the nation. Bundy's attack was swift and brutal. He viciously bludgeoned and sexually assaulted 2 young women, leaving them for dead. But the carnage didn't end there. In an eerie reflection of his ever-growing boldness, Bundy then went to another room, where he attacked 2 more women, killing one and leaving the other severely injured. The attack was so violent, so savage, that the surviving victims struggled to recount the details, their memories shrouded in a haze of fear and trauma. The sorority house, once a place of camaraderie and friendship, became a blood-soaked crime scene, a symbol of Bundy's descent into complete madness. But Bundy didn't stop there. After the Chi Omega murders, he continued his spree in Florida, killing and attacking women with terrifying speed. His attacks were methodical, cold, and calculated, as though he was no longer driven by a need to kill, but by a need to dominate. The public was paralyzed with fear, knowing that the man who had escaped custody was once again on the loose, leaving a trail of blood across the state. Bundy's escape had only unleashed his true nature. He was now a force of unrelenting violence, targeting young women without mercy. He was no longer the charming, polite student that people had once known. He was a predator, a monster whose hunger for destruction was insatiable, and the fear he instilled in the people of Florida would haunt them for years to come. On February 15, 1978, the chase finally came to an end. It wasn't a dramatic standoff. It wasn't a high-speed pursuit or a shootout. No, Ted Bundy was captured after a routine traffic stop. The man who had evaded law enforcement for years, who had left a trail of blood across multiple states, was finally brought to justice, though it would take more than handcuffs to unravel the true nature of his twisted mind. Bundy's calm demeanor during his arrest was chilling. He didn't show the slightest hint of fear or panic as the police officer approached his car. It was as though he knew it was only a matter of time. As he was handcuffed and placed in the back of a police car, Bundy remained eerily composed, almost as if he had been preparing for this moment for years. His arrest was the culmination of an exhaustive manhunt. But as Bundy was taken into custody, it became clear that his story was far from over. A new chapter was about to begin, a chapter in which Bundy, the self-proclaimed law student, would represent himself in one of the most publicized criminal trials in American history. Bundy's trial was nothing short of extraordinary. Here, he would face the consequences of his brutal actions. But in the courtroom, Bundy was anything but the villain. Instead, he presented himself as the charming, charismatic man that so many had once adored. He was articulate, confident, and cunning, traits that helped him manipulate those around him for years. But inside the courtroom, the horrors of his past were finally laid bare, as the details of his crimes were presented in shocking, heart-wrenching testimony. Bundy, refusing to accept the role of the criminal, decided to represent himself, further asserting his belief in his own intelligence and control. He spoke with authority, challenging witnesses, questioning the evidence, and weaving a web of half-truths and denial. His charm, however, could not hide the grim truth of the evidence stacked against him. His words, once so convincing to those who had trusted him, fell flat as the jury and the public were forced to confront the reality of his monstrous deeds. It was in the courtroom that Bundy's façade began to crack. His manipulative nature and ability to deceive those around him became apparent as the trial unfolded. Despite his attempts to maintain control of the narrative, the evidence painted a clear picture of his guilt. But still, Bundy fought. Even as the bodies of his victims and the sorrow of their families piled up, Bundy's pride remained intact. He could not bear to admit defeat. As Ted Bundy sat on death row, a final, chilling transformation took place. The man who had once evaded capture, who had danced through years of deception, manipulation, and murder, was now forced to face the brutal reality of his fate. But even in those final days, Bundy was not done with his twisted game. The questions that had plagued investigators and terrified the public for so long were finally answered, though they came at a steep price. Bundy, who had spent years in denial, refusing to admit his crimes even as the evidence mounted against him, began to speak. The confessions came slowly, methodically, as though he had been carefully calculating the right moment to reveal the truth. It was only in the face of death that Bundy finally acknowledged the horrors he had unleashed. But in his chillingly calm voice, there was no remorse, no sorrow for the lives he had destroyed. "I killed at least 30 women," Bundy admitted, his tone matter-of-fact, almost clinical. His words were delivered with a chilling detachment, as though he were recounting the details of an ordinary day. For years, the public had been haunted by the mystery of Bundy's killings, the fear and dread that came with each new missing person report. Now, the monster behind the veil was finally speaking, but it was too late. Bundy's confessions didn't provide the closure that the victims' families had hoped for. They didn't offer any sense of justice, no answers to the unanswered questions of why he did it or how he could commit such atrocities with no apparent motive. His revelations were unsettling in their calmness, as if he was simply stating facts, without an ounce of guilt, without any empathy for the families left behind. But his confessions weren't just for the families of his victims. They were, in part, a final game, a twisted display of control. Bundy seemed to relish in the attention, the power he still held over the media, the police, and the public. He knew that these confessions would make headlines, that his name would be spoken around the world once more. And though his time was running out, Bundy reveled in the one thing he had always craved: the ability to manipulate, to be the center of attention, even in his final moments. As the days passed, Bundy's fate was sealed. There would be no miraculous escape this time, no last-minute plea for mercy. His execution was imminent, and there was nothing left to do but wait. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy would finally face the consequences of his monstrous actions. The prison buzzed with tension as Bundy's execution date approached. His time on death row had been marked by eerie calmness and cold pragmatism. He didn't display fear or desperation, and there were no tears, just an eerie acceptance that his reign of terror was about to come to an end. But as the day drew closer, Bundy made one last request: a final meal. It was a bizarre, almost mundane request for a man who had caused so much suffering, and yet it was a fitting representation of the twisted nature of his mind. As the clock ticked down to the final moments, the world watched. News outlets gathered outside Florida State Prison, their cameras poised to capture the end of a story that had captured the world's attention for over a decade. Bundy's name had become synonymous with terror. He was the monster who walked among us, the charming young man who turned out to be a brutal killer. And now, at long last, the monster would be brought to justice. At 7:06 a.m. on January 24, 1989, the execution chamber at Florida State Prison became the setting for the final chapter of Bundy's life. Ted Bundy, strapped into the electric chair, was prepared to face his fate. The room was silent, the air thick with the weight of history. The only sound was the soft shuffling of guards and the quiet murmur of those witnessing the end of a life that had caused so much pain. As the switch was thrown, the room was filled with the crackling of electricity. The lights flickered, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The very essence of Bundy's life, the violence, the deception, the terror, was now being extinguished in an instant. It was over, but even as Bundy's life came to a shocking and violent end, the ripples of his actions continued to reverberate. His legacy would never fade. The families he had destroyed, the communities he had terrorized, would forever carry the scars of what he had done. His victims' names would be spoken, their stories would be told, and their lives would be remembered, even as Bundy's life was reduced to a single, final moment. For those who had followed Bundy's story for so long, there was no sense of triumph in his death. There was no joy in the fact that the killer who had taken so many lives had finally been brought to justice. Instead, there was a profound sadness. A sadness for the lives lost, the futures shattered, and the terror that Bundy had unleashed. His death did not bring peace. It brought only the grim reminder that evil can hide behind even the most charming of faces. He was a master of deception, a man who wore the mask of charm so flawlessly that it deceived everyone around him. Friends, family, even the authorities. Ted Bundy was the ultimate enigma, a killer who blended seamlessly into society while committing some of the most horrific crimes in modern history. His story is one of calculated manipulation, twisted games, and a chilling reminder that true evil is not always easy to recognize. Bundy fooled people with his easy smile, his polished demeanor, and his apparent intelligence. He charmed everyone from strangers to loved ones, making them believe in the version of himself he so carefully crafted. Yet, behind the facade lay a predator, one who would destroy the lives of young women and leave nothing but grief, confusion, and unanswered questions in his wake. Even after his capture, Bundy continued to defy the world's expectations. He was calm, confident, and still, even in death, a master manipulator. He never showed remorse for his victims. He never acknowledged the true gravity of the pain he had caused. His crimes were monstrous, but his ability to hide in plain sight, to wear a mask so convincing, is what continues to haunt us to this day. As we reflect on the life of Ted Bundy, we are forced to confront a hard truth. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones we least suspect. We want to believe that we can recognize evil, that it will always reveal itself in some way. But Bundy's story shows us that evil doesn't always look like what we expect. It can hide behind a charming smile, a polite demeanor, or the image of a promising young man with everything going for him. But behind it, lurking in the shadows, is something far darker. In the end, Ted Bundy couldn't escape his dark past. The crimes he committed, the lives he destroyed, and the terror he unleashed on so many will never be forgotten. His name will forever be linked to the brutal murder of at least 30 women. His story a chilling reminder of how evil can thrive in plain sight. The faces of his victims, their names, their stories, will live on, even as Bundy's life fades into history. And as the world moves on, the haunting question lingers. How many others, like Bundy, are out there, hiding in plain sight, fooling the world around them? If you're fascinated by true crime stories and the chilling details behind notorious criminals like Bundy, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Join us as we uncover the darkest chapters of history, revealing the unsettling truth behind some of the most horrifying criminals who ever lived. Don't miss out on the stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew.